Implicit and explicit learning. Okay, this video series will be a summarization of chapter 11 of the Handbook of Second Language Acquisition. Okay, it was written by multiple authors, the entire book, but it was edited by Doty and Long. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So there are two very common questions in the study of second language acquisition that the book addresses. The first one is whether or not to learn grammar explicitly, and the second one is whether we can implicitly learn a language the same way we did as kids. Meaning, as an adult, can you learn a language the same way you did as a baby? Now, I would argue that it's also a worthwhile question to ask whether it's even worth it to only use implicit mechanisms to acquire a language, right? Will only learning it implicitly be the way to be the most effective way? Or is there a combination of implicit and explicit learning that can really get you the highest results when it comes to language acquisition? I don't know. That's just me speculating. But let's get back into what the book says. And so, in order to really answer these questions, we really need to first define what implicit and explicit learning are. So, that's what this video will be about. So, here's an interesting tidbit. Implicit learning and intelligence are both worthy topics of endeavor, right? Obviously, they're worth learning about and studying, right? And so the book brings up both of these because there's actually a correlation between the two, being that they both have a similar problem when it comes to trying to study them. Here's some backstory. So when researchers first tried to define what intelligence is, they put together a bunch of tests, right? But the issue is that these tests were only measuring the outcome of intelligence. It was only later that they started paying attention to the psychological mechanisms that impact the tests. The what? Look, basically, it was only after a while that they started focusing on the mental functions that dictate the outcome. So before they were only looking at the outcome, later then they started focusing, okay, what's actually causing the outcome? So in essence, they measured the outcome of intelligence first, and then only after that is when they started testing the actual mechanisms that dictate your intelligence. And so that's when things shifted quite a bit. And so this is where intelligence and implicit learning have a lot of similarities because it's actually quite difficult to measure what it is that causes the outcome. How do you measure the mechanisms that cause implicit learning or that cause intelligence? And so the study of implicit learning kind of followed a similar path to that study of intelligence. So essentially, they finally realized that they actually should be measuring the fundamental nature of these mechanisms. Arthur Reber, the pioneer of implicit learning research, said the following about this problem, and I quote, "The central issue of trying to understand implicit learning is the lack of consciousness of the structure being learned." Whoa, whoa. In other words, he was just trying to say that we lacked a fundamental understanding of the cognitive processes behind implicit learning. Great. So you have all these problems, and a bunch of people tried to define implicit and explicit learning. So that's what we'll go over now is different ways people have defined implicit and explicit learning, and then we'll arrive at the definition that the book kind of lays out for us. Arthur Reber, the pioneer I told you about earlier, had the following two definitions for implicit and explicit learning. He defined implicit learning, and I quote, "the primitive focus process of apprehending structure by attending to frequency cues." Bro, what did he just say? I know, there's a lot. Basically, what he's trying to say is implicit learning is pattern recognition at the primitive level. So, like monkey brain go, brr. And then he defined explicit learning as, and I quote, "where various mnemonics, heuristics, and strategies are engaged to induce a representational system." I'd be lying to you if I didn't whip out the dictionary immediately after reading this. So, what did he mean? There's a lot of fancy words here, but I'm actually going to focus on just one. So, the one word I want to focus on is induce. Okay? Induce means to take lessons from specific examples that get you understanding the rules and everything. So an example of that would be reading the English word, the big red car, right? And when you read that, you induce that there's a certain order that adjectives must follow before the noun. And so if you say the big red car, sounds very normal compared to the red big car, right? It sounds a little weird. So what he meant by this definition of explicit learning is basically the use of memory tricks, mental strategies or mental shortcuts and strategies in order to learn the general rules of a language from specific examples. So specific examples are basically sentences or messages in the target language that get you exposed to certain rules of the language. Later, Hayes and Broadbent came around to further precise the definition of implicit learning. They called it, and I quote, the unselective and passive aggregation of information about the co-occurrence of environmental events and features. Dude, my head's gonna explode. Look, I could dissect this sentence a lot. I did, but I'll leave you with the layman's definition of this sentence. Implicit learning is the categorization and organization of patterns in your subconscious brain of all the rules of the language just purely by exposure. Okay. So implicit learning, what they're trying to say is learning without really knowing what's going on. It's just like your brain is doing all this patterns recognition for you. And you know what? Before we get to the simplest definition of implicit learning, let's dive just a little bit deeper. It is difficult to define consciousness, difficult to define awareness. So many people have used other terms in relation to implicit learning. There's intentionality and automaticity. From the author's perspective, both words are quite distinct from what implicit learning actually entails. Because with intentionality, subjects in experiments are probably more likely to want to learn something and therefore they will learn something. And automaticity is really just a result of the learning process, not a characteristic of it, which becomes a little bit hard to define. Replacing awareness with intentionality or automaticity doesn't really solve the conceptual problem. See, when we're trying to define implicit and explicit learning, we still need to define a very important term, and that is awareness. How do we define awareness? Therefore, the author just puts all this together and says, look, here's what implicit learning is. Implicit learning is learning with no awareness of what's being learned. Okay, that's the simple definition that this book arrives at. And so, okay, we have a basic understanding of what implicit learning kind of is. Let's go over a couple of terms that tend to get confused with implicit learning. We have inductive learning and we have implicit memory. Inductive learning means going from the particular to the broad, from specific to general, from examples to rules. Inductive learning is being in the trenches and then coming up with the rules of the language after the fact. It's very different and quite literally the opposite of deductive learning. And so the author goes on to say that inductive learning and implicit learning are orthogonal concepts. What what does orthogonal mean? I don't know. Let's go over it. Look, orthogonal means that they are both perpendicular concepts, meaning they can exist independently of each other. But there will be a point, or there can be a point where they intersect. And so they can be used together, but they can absolutely be used independently of each other. Implicit memory is also very different from implicit learning because implicit memory is really just talking about where your knowledge gets stored, not so much the mechanism behind the storage, which would be where implicit learning comes into play. And so it's like you can use implicit learning to attain implicit memory, but they kind of exist independently of each other. One kind of maybe leads to the other, and implicit learning may be leading to implicit memory. But even then, things that are in implicit memory tend to stay in implicit memory unless you do something to take them to explicit memory. This is actually really interesting. You know, I'll go off on a riff real quick. Basically, when it comes to acquiring versus learning a language, especially Spanish, that's what we talk about here at Apprenticks, is when it comes to acquiring Spanish, you can do a lot of implicit learning first, and then you can do some learning of the grammar after you've acquired it, and you'll take your knowledge that's in implicit memory over to explicit memory by learning grammar. And that's a really powerful tool that I talk about a lot more in other videos, but we'll just stick to what the book talks about. So all this is really important to know because implicit learning is really, really powerful for certain applications, and for other applications, not as much. And so I truly believe that the combination of implicit and explicit learning is what will take you much further in your language acquisition than anything else. But we'll get to that later. For now, we can rest easy knowing that implicit learning is learning without awareness of what's being learned, and explicit learning being learning with awareness of what's being learned. And this applies really well. Implicit learning applies really well to linguistics because you and I are examples of that, right? My native tongue is English and Spanish, whatever your native tongue is. We both learned our native tongues through implicit learning, right? Because think about it, by the time we were 5, we were able to use so many grammar concepts without having heard of a single one of them. We just kind of knew what the patterns are because of all the words and sentences and paragraphs that our parents had spoken to us over time. So that's the power of implicit learning, is it can get you really far, but it might not be the whole question, right? So that's it for this video. We've gone ahead and defined the difference between implicit and explicit learning. So stay tuned for the next one.